When I read today's gospel account of the healing of the man born blind, I was reminded of something that happened a few years ago when I was reading over another passage of John's gospel, the section where Jesus tells the apostles that in a short time they will see him no longer, but then they will see him again. And I found myself responding a bit like the apostles themselves responded. I found myself scratching my head. Now I understand, or I think I understand at least, that he was referring to the fact that he would suffer and die and that he would rise again. But then he goes on to say, "You will be weeping and wailing while the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will be turned to joy." And those words gave me the sense that he was referring to a period longer than just the 3 days between his death and his resurrection. So I went back to that first thing that he says to them in the gospel passage, the business of not seeing them and then seeing him again. And I asked myself, where have I heard something like that before? First, I thought of the blind man whom Jesus heals in stages, the one who, when Jesus first rubs his eyes and asks if he can see anything, answers and says, "I see people, but they look like trees." And so Jesus rubs his eyes again, and this time the man can see. But when I checked, I realized that that miracle probably isn't connected to this section of John's Gospel, since it occurs in the Gospel of Mark. But then I started looking at the healing of another blind man, the one that occurs in our Gospel for today, the story of the man born blind. And I wondered if Jesus, or at least John the Evangelist, wasn't pointing back to this incident of the healing of the man born blind as the key to what Jesus' words meant in that later section of the Gospel. And it does seem to fit when you think about it. In the story of the man born blind that we hear today, Jesus arrives on the scene and demonstrates the love and the mercy of God in healing this blind man, and then he leaves. And then there's a long period between that healing when Jesus returns again. And through that whole period, the blind man has never actually seen Jesus, even though he's been healed by him. Remember, the Gospel tells us that Jesus spat and made some mud and rubbed it in his eyes, and then told him to go and wash his eyes in the pool. And the Gospel says that the man came back, but he doesn't say that he saw Jesus at that point. Perhaps by the time he came back, Jesus was already gone, so he never really got to see him. Instead, the blind man had to endure a fair amount of difficulty in his life, living with this miracle of God's mercy to him. First, he tries to go home, but the people who were his neighbors can't believe it's the same man. Some say he just looks like the man they knew. Next, he's hauled before the religious leaders, who won't believe him when he says what happened. And then his parents seem almost to distance themselves from him as well, saying, "He's our son, but we don't know what happened to him. Ask him." And finally, the man is again brought before the authorities, who still don't believe him and accuse him of being a sinner. And they cast him out. But the blind man's faith in Jesus is strong, even though he has never seen his face. Until at the end, Jesus returns and reveals himself to him. So it's almost as though later in John's Gospel, as Jesus prepares to leave his disciples, Jesus is pointing back to this example of the man born blind and encouraging the disciples not to lose heart, but to remain faithful as that blind man does, that they might not turn away from him when his friends and family reject them, or when the religious authorities harass and persecute them, that even during that time that they don't see him, they might continue to tell others of what he's done for them, and to trust that they will see him again when he comes again in glory. And I believe that Jesus would address those same words to each one of us as well. Because just like the man born blind that we hear about today, and just like the disciples whom Jesus is about to take leave of and later in the Gospel, we're all in that same long period between his healing of us and his return. We are all in that period of having felt and experienced his love and mercy, but still not seeing him as fully as we might like to. And just like both the man born blind and the disciples in the Gospel, it isn't always easy for us to hold on to our faith in him in this in-between time. As Christians in the world today, we're living in a lifestyle that's countercultural, a lifestyle that's misunderstood and even poo-pooed by society around us. The values that we strive to uphold and live by are laughed at by many in the world today. And given that subtle and not so subtle pressure from society, from the world around us, it wouldn't be so surprising for us to ask ourselves, did we perhaps take a wrong turn somewhere back there? But I think that Jesus is holding up the example of this blind man to us as well today, telling us not to worry about this little while that we don't see him, and promising us that if we remember the love and the mercy that we have received from him, if we continue to tell others of what he has done for us as clearly and as courageously as the man born blind does, we too will be rewarded by seeing him face to face in another little while. So maybe today we could pray that God might help us to cherish the grace that we have already received from God, that we might not never forget the goodness that God has given us, that our faith in the love and the mercy of our God might not grow weaker no matter what happens to us, but that it might grow and deepen, and that we might continue to share God's love and God's mercy with others by all that we say and all that we